In this section, I'm pleased to introduce the staff of the GSA who are going to talk through the program design, how the program operates. They're going to talk through the units, the themes of the units, how the units operate, their preoccupations and interests. And we're also going to have presentations from the program conveners for architectural history and theory, from architectural professional practice, and importantly from making, the newest program that we're trying to develop within the school that we embarked on 2 years ago.
So Unit 7 is a new unit this year that we formed and formulated in discussion, and I think we're interested in African genealogies of practice. A lot of the genealogies of architectural practice come from a Eurocentric lens. And we're interested in developing an African genealogy of practice. And we're interested in doing that in relation to urban spaces and urbanity. There's been a lot of work around this understanding of African cities or African urbanity as its own metropolitan type that isn't problematic or post-colonial or kind of post-apartheid as this kind of defining condition, but it has a type, its own type and logic. A lot of work has been done around this in the social sciences. There's a lot of work happening in the African Center for Cities and by writers at WITS and WISA, by Nuttall and Bembe. But to date, architects are kind of behind in this conversation, and certainly architecture schools are behind. We approach the city as a problematic situation. So we formed this unit really to see if we could extend that body of research into the architectural space, and to look at African cities as their own type of inhabitation of hope in conditions of constant flux. And they have this particular condition because of their largely post-colonial cities. So, but without speaking specifically to coloniality, we want to understand what is that condition. And then each year we look at a different city. This year we started with Johannesburg and understanding Johannesburg as a dreamscape, a dream born out of a kind of feverish lust for gold and opportunity and power and wealth and myth and politics. But all of those things manifest themselves in concrete form, in material tectonic architectural form in the city that we see. And so we kind of positioning ourselves as a research unit. That's how we work. We see the students as co-researchers, and we're building together an architectural body of work that can speak to the work that's already happening in the social sciences.
So we've chosen the site Langlaagte, which is the original farm that first deposits of gold were discovered in 1886. And the reason why we chose that farm is because even the narrative of Langlaagte built the dream of what we understand as Johannesburg today. And there are very different contexts and situations and societies that have been built up from a dream of wanting to find logics of gold. And from that dream, we sort of began to map out the borders of the Langlaagte farm in contemporary time, and have realized that they're still sort of being held together by very clear industrialized or city infrastructures like main highways and roads that still articulate the dreamscape of Langlaagte of the colonial era and still manifests itself in the way that we understand time now. And in doing so, we also sort of position the unit critically in terms of its pedagogy with the ideas of making and drawing and walking and seeing the city differently from, as Injalan pointed out, this problematizing of the city, but more so looking at it as what is the city is what it is for the reason that it is. And in reading the city for what it is and not how you want it to be first, we might be able to articulate different or new ways of understanding the metropolis.
So I think oftentimes as architects, we focus quite intentionally on the made thing. And I think in our unit, we're really concerned with how the made thing came to be, how we could cause it to be differently. And so for us, making in the unit is really integral to what the students are doing, because they're learning to read the city, but they're not reading it through books. They're having to walk it. They're having to read about it. They're having to produce what we call textiographies, text pieces. They produce drawings, and they produce artifacts. So we're working in text, drawing, in artifacts, and they're doing that translation all the time so that they can read the city and make sense of it. So for us, making is completely fundamental to the way the unit works.
Ruby and myself are young architects. We're both passionate about South Africa or African architecture, and passionate about the terrains and the geology and the ecology of this country. And so, I was always interested personally in water and how it sort of delineates societies and cultures, and how people and cities and neighborhoods form around rivers and dams and lakes and the ocean. And so we're focusing on that this year, but specifically on the tangents in where either the lapses in architectural pedagogical teaching and architectural design does or doesn't address those terrains of where cities and people live around water, and how it could be bettered and how it could develop in a more meaningful and an egalitarian way, meaning in a way where certain groups of people don't necessarily benefit more from development and city building more than other people. And so there's a big lapse between where we as designers and as teachers should educate the young, new up-and-coming architects to think about aspects of living around water and who we should be catering our designs for that.
So our critical thinkers, I would say, we have a student called Sisetu, and she's not afraid to make as well. She started off in Alexander looking at water there, if it could possibly be used in a ritual. She's found that she's had to move sites because the residents of Alexandra actually don't appreciate the water there, it's too polluted. And they actually go into suburban areas to practice their rituals and then come back into the township areas.
So both Ruby and I were former students of the GSA. Obviously, we've been educated and brought up in this new cultural way of pedagogical thinking, which is quite unique to most of architectural education in South Africa. So at the GSA, in the first year of the GSA, my thesis had to do with re-looking at how to clean up and reinvigorate the acid mine drainage and mine dumps in the southern end of Johannesburg through using re-envisioned timber mills. It's sort of like a very out there project, but I was allowed the freedom of working quite speculatively and then very pragmatically at the end of the year for a project that was considered, quite new in architectural pedagogy at UJ then. I continue to follow that passion of thinking of using the natural resources which are currently available to us. In my year, I was looking at timber tree plantations, and this year we are, as a unit, we are thinking of water, drains of water. And so these things very nicely tie in together for me personally, and I think we can continue to grow on that. The traditional, I always make this analogy, the traditional way of students who get brought up in the inland of South Africa is that you get taught a concrete strip foundation and a raft foundation and brickwork detail, and then you get sent off into the world and you don't understand anything about lighter frame construction, alternative construction technologies, weaving, Adobe, rammed earth construction. You get taught almost none of that. And I think that's a weakness of architectural pedagogy generally in the inland of South Africa, but across South Africa as well. And I think we can change that. Our unit, we can change that.
In 2022, Unit 15X explored the theme of memory. And it was defined as memory that looked at the post-apartheid memory and the way we memorialize architecture, landscape, and urban design as a concept. So we picked that topic because we felt that it had been plus 26 years post-independence, and it was time to relook at how society, especially in the physical sense, memorializes its struggles, with specific reference to the apartheid struggle. And so we set out to do the project within the province of Gauteng, simply because of the COVID restrictions in terms of travel. So we picked 4 sites in Gauteng that we took our students as a site of exploration of this memory project.
The interesting part, though, is that the 4 sites didn't end there. We have and have always had a couple of international students in our units. So we had students from Namibia. Those students from Namibia were quite interested in also expressing and talking about the narratives and the history behind their own cultures and their own practices. I think the interesting one was from a student, Danielle. Her project was also quite influenced by our site visit in Soweto, and she saw a connection between the forced removals that happened back home in Namibia and what we were learning about in Soweto as well.
Because of the nature of the projects, landscape projects require that you explore the physical space. That means understanding the makings of a landscape. You have to understand the context. Secondly, you make a memorial, you're making a physical object. You need to visualize it, you need to suggest how it is going to be put together, how it will be put onto the ground. So we've taken those aspects that we need to convey as designers to be very clear to society how we want to memorialize as requirements of the outputs of our students. We don't just ask our students to present us with conceptual ideas of how to remember something. An aspect of that will be to take it further into detailing as to how that particular memorial space is made, with what materials. And we know that materials are exposed to the elements, weathering, they change over time. How is that change envisaged? And the landscape itself is an element that changes. Landscape grows. It has trees, it has grass, it has all of these elements that need to be thought about for a designer early on in the design process, and to imagine it, how it's going to be within 50 years. So I think that we now challenge our students to explore very clearly and explain to us what the project is in terms of its making, in terms of its materials, in terms of future changes. And I think that is an aspect that has become much more part of our exploration, and it's becoming much more clear for us and as well as the students as to what we want when we say making within the landscape unit of 15X.
Unit 17, I think, is one of the more established units, one of the older units in the group. We set up in 2017, and so I've been doing this a while, and like any good experiment, redoing things and kind of like iteration of doing things again and again, I think has allowed us to experiment in many different directions. But the kind of core idea of our unit is that we're makers. We experiment with materials and making, and that's where our interests lie. And then we're very interested in how materials then connect to wider social issues, because making and materiality involves everybody in society, and everybody kind of relates to the materials around them in different ways. They carry different cultural resonance and meaning for everybody. So we're interested in unpacking those questions, and we do that through the students and through the work and through making. So we actually literally start a process of making with the students, and then the philosophy and the theory kind of follows from the processes of making, and that's how we've always worked in this unit.
It's my first time teaching here at GSA, and our theme is composites. We're looking at this idea of composites and how things come together to create something much more stronger, right? And for me, it's spirituality, identity, and social ideology, right? And how that manifests itself as architecture. But what's special about our unit is that every individual student, even Greg as the leader, we have our own understanding of what composite is, and we throw it in the pot, and then we come up with something that's rigid and strong. Like a woven fabric, it's quite strong and rigid. So that's what we're doing this year.
Yeah, I like to. I mean, I hope I haven't been here for too long. But I probably me and one or two, a handful of others were here for the last suck-up review. And I do remember it quite well. And some of the challenges that we were facing and have been facing up until this point, a lot have had to do with the environment that we teach in. So we haven't had a space to teach in, really, like a space to support in-studio work. And now having this facility, this building, has been a huge boon for us this year. It's the first year that we're in here, having proper lecture venues, having a studio where students can work till late at night. And I remember when I was a student, and Lolagela is also from an institution where they worked in studio. And the kind of collaborative working that we're doing this year could not have happened if we didn't have this facility, this building, and this space to make a mess, just to like make stuff and occupy space and really explore ideas in an expansive way. We have access to a workshop now. Our students are actually currently in a workshop, the woodwork workshop at FADA, making things. And so for the time of the pandemic and previous years, we didn't have a space for that. Students were making things in their kitchen at home. So definitely there's much more support for what we're doing now. I feel like spatially and materially there's much more support.
So Unit 20 is inspired by Anansesem, which is the storytelling tradition of the Akan people in Ghana. We are inspired by storytelling, and we are interested in the parallel relationship between film and architecture. Last year, our site, which was the city of Johannesburg, we termed as the prompt site because we were quite interested in how students can draw multiple narratives in the city of Johannesburg to develop their own interests and to kind of test architectural ideas and interventions to respond to some of the themes that they were interested in. So Unit 20 is really interested in the transformative pedagogy approach of the school, GSA. And so we are quite interested in how our approach to interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary approach to design thinking and design research becomes the forefront of the way that we teach and the way that we do design research in our studios. So we employ multidisciplinary approaches like film, like storytelling, like music, into architecture to see how students can begin to think about how architecture is derived from alternative ways, from the conventional ways of thinking of architecture, but at the same time thinking about space. So how do we really think of multidisciplinary as a tool, as an approach to architecture?
So how the students have developed over the 2 years that we've been teaching at the GSA is that they've started to understand that the manifestation of space isn't necessarily stringent on a site analysis that you would only gather on a practical level. You'd gather information based on how the people are living and how they are engaging with the space that they're investigating. The site analysis and how we approach site and how we see site is through the lens of film, and the point is that essentially we are architects that are building atmospheres and we're building worlds. So we don't necessarily need to understand only how the space is currently being lived and engaged with. We also need to start to imagine how it could be, and utilizing film and utilizing other disciplines to interpret that has really helped the students to engage with the site in a more tangible and intangible manner.
Last year we were interested in Johannesburg, but we were interested in Johannesburg in its broadness, in its multiple layered kind of nature, multiple diverse cultures, and almost like a diasporic nature of it. This year, we moved to Pretoria, the capital city. And in moving to Pretoria comes with a theme, which is the capital, the idea of power. And so this year, we are interested in the power dynamics that are embedded in the city of Pretoria. We are interested in how time plays role in the power dynamics, and we are interested in dual realities. In this era, we can't look at everything in the physical. There are things that are moving into 4IR, into virtual spaces. And so we are interested in multiple dimensions. We are interested in diverse and different narratives. So the idea of storytelling not being a single narrative is also being applied in the way we perceive space, in either it's physical or in a virtual. So we've actually really built on that from last year.
Our unit, Phantom Cartography, of which I'm the lead and Azra Gabru is the tutor, we are looking at two major issues this year, the one being the city of Johannesburg, and we're looking at a particular region of the city, the historical Randkieslaagte Triangle, which was the original kind of formal establishment of the city when gold was found on the reef. And the other major issue that we're looking at or focusing on this year is climate change. But not only in environmental terms, we're also looking at changing climates, which is really important to acknowledge that it's not only an environmental thing, it's also a political thing, it's an economic thing, it's a social thing. So this year we've spent a lot of time formulating a method whereby the students work individually to form their major projects, their design projects. And at the same time, we're spending a lot of time in the first semester working in groups. And the purpose of that is really just to try and get the students accustomed to the, I don't want to say an office environment, but the reality of working together as a team in order to produce something that is based on a series of ideas that can then be shared. And along with that are a series of categories or themes that each group is looking at specifically, whether it's the history of the city, the materiality of the city, urban framework, landscaping, etc. And this will form a kind of unit archive, which the students can then use as a resource in the development of their design projects.
In terms of fleshing out a proposal or a DP, I wouldn't say that it happens overnight. The unit adopts an iterative process where we constantly revisit the objectives and aims of the project. There isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, and it is taken by project base. We want students to work on their propositions, ideally over a year or two, but the idea is that the work should be meaningful and in a way it's something that you could take forward into your practice.
This year we've also really tried to align the scheduling of different activities and tutorials through the course of our year in the unit schedule with that of making. One of the things that we spent a lot of time on is the group work. So we're making this large model, which is going to be a fundamental part of how each individual project is located within the city. And the model itself is a construction of a certain kind, and we're certainly working a lot more with making this year than we did last year. The making module is a lot more advanced this year, which is a fantastic thing. The themes that making is exploring, such as ecology, composite drawing, those are the themes that our unit is also exploring, so that we can achieve a better balance between the conceptual mapping framework type projects that we focused on last year, and to develop those into technical, tectonic, structural propositions this year.
The unit interest is framed conceptually as an investigation of architecture as infrastructure, or architecture's relationship to infrastructure.
We're particularly interested with a sectional understanding across the city of Johannesburg. As a city that's heritage is so built on resource extraction, we find it really interesting to understand the relationship between the strata of the city in section and what is accrued on top. In particular, where we've defined this understanding, or this kind of conceptual interpretation, as dealing with the artificial, with the territorial, and with the urban. And we're particularly interested in students pursuing projects that look at the overlaps between those different conceptual framings.
At the core of the unit's engagement with transformation is this idea of rooting or grounding the research inquiry and intellectual development in local experience, first of all, which is why we chose Johannesburg as our site of investigation, and for them to begin to overturn the languages of colonialism, of apartheid, kind of orthodox languages of architecture that primarily come from the West. So this is kind of what we've inherited as a discipline. And also to equip the students with a solid knowledge of themselves, and of their history. If not equipped with this solid knowledge of self, with this solid sort of self-centered position, it's difficult to resist a lot of the propagandas that come from the North or from the West, and it's difficult to be critical of the canon that we've inherited in the architecture discipline.
I think for me, transformation is about expanding the definition of what architecture is. I think the definition of architecture has been like west-facing, but now it's about including our own practices, our own cultures. I think sometimes, especially for somebody who comes, I come from the township, so coming from a township, you don't know what architecture is. You know, you don't realize that what you live with in your context is also considered architecture, because the definition of architecture is so distant. For me as a teacher, it's about letting students know that architecture is so much more than what the Western have defined it as. So it's about bringing your own culture in it, bringing your own experiences, bringing your own stories, expanding on methodologies, looking at your childhood, your family. So it's about realizing that architecture is everywhere and anywhere, and we need to start including that in how we practice it, especially also in Unit 22.
So this year we look at the SPECT in Unit 23. So basically what the SPECT looks at is we're looking at African futures. And so what we really question is, how do we create these African futures? Because quite often we have an idea of what we're looking for in architecture, but never really understanding how do we get there and what do these futures look like. So in some ways, when we're looking at these African futures, we're saying that these are our goals and how do we get there? So the way that we engage with that is by, in some ways, peeling back the colonial layers. And if we peel back those colonial layers, then we're asking, what layers do we use to inform how these future cities are envisioned?
So specifically, we're asking the students in Unit 23 to identify a specific event in their life that was impactful to how they view the world and the city today. And then we ask them to localize that event within the broader context of what that event means to the world and to their community. And then when we zoom further out into a third scale, we look at how these ideas are formed or how they are made or how they come to be within a diasporic sense. So essentially, we ask the students to look at 3 specific scales that apply to the unit through events so that they can peel back the layers, like Jan said, and interrogate what these events mean, how these events come to be, and how to spatialize these events. So in terms of history and theory, we fold that in by asking the students to read and research where the ideas and ideologies that they're interested come from and how those are related to architecture and spatiality. And then in terms of professional practice, I think in general in tutorials, we ask them what kind of architects and spatial practitioners that they're trying to be. In terms of making, our briefs are structured primarily by Anne in order for them to create a design output for each brief using specific prompts that we have formulated from our own frame of reference and kind of what the unit is looking at as a whole. And then we also couple that with a making brief where we ask them to make and produce specific outcomes which could be read as more traditional within the practice of architecture.
For the design briefs or the design components of the briefs, they're quite conceptual and quite speculative. So that kind of gives the students a little bit of freedom to explore different methods and ways of working. And then the making components of the briefs are a little bit more technical. So that's when we ask them to produce very particular types of plans. They have to be scaled with elevations or sections. And so I think the kind of thinking behind that is that in the first quarter, or the first semester particularly, that those two components are explored separately. And in the second semester, then we kind of fold the two into one another. So at the end of the year, we hope that what the students produce are not only kind of design drawings and speculative drawings or conceptual drawings of ideas and questions, but they are kind of grounded in some kind of architecture, and that we can still see a kind of architectural language that's starting to be developed through that. So last year I was Unit 14 lead, and so this year I'm Unit 23 lead. But I think there are still some kinds of questions that we've taken from Unit 24 that have become quite interesting and quite important to Unit 23. So I think in Unit 14, we were previously looking at rogue economies or rogue routes. So in some ways questioning the kind of undercurrents and rogue practices within the city. And so, for example, one specific project that we looked at last year was Mbelo Manyatela's project. So he questioned the aspirations that are kind of embedded and embodied within specific Zulu proverbs. And so he looks at proverbs from the point of view of trying to understand and dissect the aspirations contained with them, and especially aspirations towards a future city. Within these proverbs are embedded specific conditions where you have migrant groups who move from KZN and so on into Johannesburg. And so as part of that kind of movement from KZN into Johannesburg was the idea of the gold rush. And so as part of that, you have people who enter the city with an idea of what these cities look like, based on what these proverbs kind of outline, that it is the city of gold, and so on. And so when they enter, they have these hopes and aspirations that come with these ideas and these visions of the city. And as part of that, he starts to dissect it to question what other aspirations are embedded within these proverbs, and how do these proverbs then produce another version of what the city should look like. So for example, he takes the Johannesburg city skyline, and often this Johannesburg city skyline is associated with ideas of hope, a better life, opportunities, and so on. And so he then questions, what do these opportunities then look like in the future? So if it isn't gold, then what else could it be?
So Unit 24 is thematically interested in repositories of identity, and this is derived from the Wolof term, digante, which translates to a condition of being in between. So in between two places, or something that is shared or reciprocated. Our site for this year is the West African country of Senegal, which is located on the westernmost point of the continent. And it is known historically as an entry point, exit point, and thoroughfare due to its history of slavery and colonization. We believe that Senegal exists in a state of digante, and we are researching the country via satellite research. So the unit has been formulated through our own interests, both Tanya and myself. I come from a very rich heritage. My father is Taiwanese and my mother is Indian. And I come from a very hybrid culture, which I found really interesting, but it also created this middle space for me to exist in, which I found was not fully expressed in the architectural world.
My interest in identity is a little bit more complex and contested. It's because my own lineage is quite undefined and quite mixed, which has resulted in my own middle space not having any sort of definition. And through my own practice, I at least hope to explore ways in which architecturally these spaces manifest, and how identities like my own create space from multiple different geographies, contested or not. And as a student, I particularly looked at identity in contested territories and explored what those speculations could look like.
So Unit 24 is working quite closely with making. We utilize the skills that the students learn in making and incorporate them into the outputs, as well as determine and plan our briefs in relation to the outputs for making. We require our students to produce artifacts at each brief, along with a series of technical construction drawings that show us how the artifact is created. So we do work quite closely with making. And I think that the students at the moment are working quite closely with making in the regards to site, climate and ecology studies. So in this instance, students are producing an output that satisfies both our requirements as a unit and making's requirements.
In 2022, we took the position that like vantage or the position that students hold are important in how we configure the curriculum. This included kind of like positions where students were located specifically within Johannesburg and using theory to provoke different ways that they can look at the city of Johannesburg. So taking a leaf from people like Paulo Freire, the South American scholar, our position was that scholarship has to be geographically located, but also site-specific. So it was important for us to have students thinking about what it means to be looking at the profession from Africa. Secondly, we also were looking at the relationship between architecture as a way to both make and think. So we don't distinguish between the intellectual and the manual labor of producing architecture. So we're trying to make those lines between making and thinking more explicit for students. So in 2022, we consolidated our work into a manifesto which we called Theory Making. And the idea was that we blur the lines between theory and making, and also make it very clear, or like for students, that one doesn't precede the other, and oscillating between the two. And it manifested in a publication and an exhibit. And the idea was that students would present work that was produced in making as theory and present work that was made in theory as making, so that we make it very clear that these are interdependent modes of working. And so more than anything, I think it was quite successful because the students, when they saw the work produced in one place, it started to make sense why we were arguing that these are not different ways to think or make architecture. And I think it served for us as well as a reminder of how reliant on each other these two are.
So this year, the Architectural History and Theory course aims to explore a broad range of adjacent themes related to architecture, such as film, art, urbanity, orality, soundscapes, infrastructure, in order to expose the students to a really wide variety of both traditional and contemporary voices that relates to architectural history and theory and how archiving happens.
As a course coordinator, I'm basically facilitating the lectures of some of the guest lectures, as well as the kind of in-house lectures that happens. And also as a practitioner now, I have seen like the importance of the course. Adding on to it is that we have Heather Dodd as one of the in-house kind of lecturers that assist in giving students lectures and discussions on practice and how to manage practice. And we all know Heather Dodd and her kind of influence or her landmark in the architectural industry.
What we've done this year is we've got 2 immersion weeks at the beginning of quarter 1 and quarter 3. The quarter 1 week is foundational. We get all the students into a workshop. They've never worked with metal, they don't know how to weld. This is an unfamiliar. So just familiarizing them with the space of making and the space of building and giving them the confidence to work with materials is really important. But it also allows us to observe them and observe the ability of the students. And at the end of the immersion, they were asked to fill in a technical competency form. And based on that, we're running a series of technical electives in casting, molding, drawing, architectural model making. All of those things form the inputs of the course. And the main outputs of the course this year are a climate study, which is another kind of idea of bringing where practice is going into the school, and a making study, which is like a technical thesis in the old-fashioned way, and then they have a thesis supervisor for that.